Imagine you're standing on a runway in 2050. The air smells like jet fuel and history. And then you hear it. A low, thunderous rumble that shakes the ground beneath your feet, vibrates in your chest, and rattles the fillings in your teeth. You look up and you see it. A massive, 8-engine beast clawing its way into the sky. And someone standing next to you turns and says, "That plane was designed before your grandfather was born." That is not science fiction. That is not a movie. That is the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. And what you are about to hear is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of human engineering, military power, and national will. This is the story of a bomber that was sketched out on a piece of paper in a hotel room over a single weekend in 1948, that flew through the most dangerous skies of the Cold War, that dropped bombs in Vietnam, Kuwait, Afghanistan, and Iraq, that outlasted every single aircraft ever designed to replace it, and that the United States Air Force is now planning to keep flying all the way to the year 2050 and possibly beyond. 100 years. Nearly 1 century of continuous service from a single aircraft design. No other weapon in the history of warfare has ever come close to this. Not a ship, not a tank, not a rifle, not a submarine. Nothing. The B-52 is in a category so far beyond anything else ever built that military historians genuinely struggle to find the right words to describe it. So sit back, because the next hour is going to take you on a journey through one of the greatest untold stories of American power, ingenuity, determination, and sheer, stubborn refusal to give up on something that works. This is the B-52 Stratofortress, and its story begins not on a runway, not in a factory, but in a hotel room in Dayton, Ohio, during one of the most desperate moments in American aviation history. The year is 1948. World War II has been over for 3 years. The United States has emerged from that conflict as the most powerful nation on earth. Its factories are humming. Its economy is roaring. Its military is the envy of every nation in the world. But in the halls of the Pentagon and in the secret briefing rooms of Washington, there's a creeping, bone-deep fear that keeps the generals awake at night. Because the Soviet Union has the bomb. On August 29, 1949, the Soviets will detonate their first nuclear weapon, and the world will never be the same again. But even before that test, American military planners know it is coming. They know that the age of nuclear warfare is dawning, and they know that if America is going to survive in this terrifying new world, it is going to need a way to deliver nuclear weapons to targets deep inside Soviet territory. Targets that are thousands of miles away. Targets protected by the most advanced air defenses ever built. America needs a bomber. Not just any bomber. A bomber unlike anything that has ever flown before. A bomber that can fly high enough to avoid enemy fighters. Fast enough to outrun surface-to-air missiles. Far enough to reach Moscow from bases in the continental United States, strike its target, and return home. The Strategic Air Command, the most powerful military organization in American history, is given the mission, and they turn to Boeing. Now, at this point in our story, you need to understand something about the relationship between the United States military and Boeing in 1948. These two institutions have been partners in aviation since the earliest days of flight. Boeing has already built the B-17 Flying Fortress, the iconic 4-engine bomber that hammered Nazi Germany into rubble from the skies over Europe. They have built the B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ended World War II. Boeing knows how to build bombers. They know how to build big, powerful, long-range aircraft that can absorb punishment and keep flying. So when the Air Force comes to them in 1947 and says they need a new strategic bomber, Boeing is ready to answer the call. The initial specifications are clear enough. The Air Force wants a jet-powered bomber. Not a propeller-driven aircraft like the B-29, but a true jet bomber, taking advantage of the revolutionary new engine technology that has emerged from the war years. The bomber needs to carry a nuclear weapon. It needs to fly at high altitude, and it needs enough range to strike the Soviet Union and return. Boeing goes to work, and their engineers begin designing what they call Model 462. It is a massive aircraft, straight wings, 6 jet engines. It looks, in many ways, like a scaled-up version of the B-29, adapted for the jet age. The Air Force looks at Model 462, and they are not impressed. They want something faster, something with more range, something that pushes the absolute boundaries of what is possible in 1947. Boeing goes back to work. They come back with Model 464, then 464 to 16, then 464 to 17. Version after version, each one better than the last. Each one still not quite what the Air Force wants. The generals want more speed, more altitude, more range. It seems like an impossible combination. You cannot make an aircraft faster without making it heavier, and when you make it heavier, you reduce its range. The physics seem to be working against Boeing at every turn. And then comes the weekend that changes everything. It is October 1948. A team of Boeing engineers and executives travels to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, for what they expect to be a routine meeting with Air Force procurement officers. What happens instead is anything but routine. The Air Force representatives hand the Boeing team a new set of requirements. Requirements so demanding, so extreme, so far beyond what anyone has ever attempted before, that the Boeing engineers are initially stunned. The Air Force wants a bomber with swept wings, like the wings on the new German jet fighters that have revolutionized aerial combat. Swept wings will allow much higher speeds, but swept wings on a bomber of this size have never been tried before. No one knows if it will even work. The Air Force also wants the aircraft to be able to fly without refueling for a range that seems almost science fictional at the time. And they want it fast. The message is clear. Give us something revolutionary. Give us something that has never existed before, or we will go somewhere else. The Boeing team goes back to their hotel that night with a challenge that seems almost impossible to meet. And then something extraordinary happens. The lead engineer on the team, a brilliant, relentless man named Ed Wells, decides that they are not going to go to bed that night. Instead, the team spreads out in the hotel room. They call a local hobby shop and purchase balsa wood. They find paper and pencils. And over the course of a single weekend, locked in a Dayton hotel room, they redesign the entire aircraft from scratch. 8 engines instead of 6. Swept wings like the new jet fighters. A completely new fuselage. A new approach to the entire aircraft architecture. They build a small balsa wood model of the new design with their own hands. They write up a detailed engineering proposal. 33 pages of specifications, drawings, and technical data. And on Monday morning, they walk back into the Air Force meeting and hand the whole package over. The Air Force officers look at the model. They look at the specifications. And they tell Boeing that this, finally, is what they have been looking for. The B-52 Stratofortress is born. But of course, designing an aircraft on a hotel room weekend and actually building it are two very different things. The road from that Dayton hotel room to a flying aircraft would take 5 more years of extraordinary engineering effort, countless technical breakthroughs, and the combined genius of some of the most talented aerospace engineers in American history. The challenges that Boeing's engineers faced in turning the hotel room sketches into a real aircraft were enormous. The swept-wing design, while promising on paper, created complex aerodynamic forces that no one had ever dealt with on an aircraft of this size. The 8 jet engines, arranged in pairs under the wings in distinctive pods, had to be carefully integrated into the aircraft structure without creating dangerous vibration patterns. The fuel system, which would eventually hold enough jet fuel to fill more than 1,000 family cars, had to be designed so that the fuel could be transferred between tanks in flight to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity as fuel burned off. The landing gear presented its own unique challenge. On a conventional aircraft, the landing gear folds sideways into the wings or fuselage when retracted. But the B-52's wings were so long and so flexible that they drooped significantly when the aircraft was on the ground, and then flexed upward in flight. A conventional landing gear arrangement simply would not work. Boeing's engineers came up with a solution that was completely unlike anything ever used before. The B-52 uses a bicycle-style landing gear arrangement, with 4 pairs of wheels arranged in tandem along the center line of the fuselage, with small outrigger wheels at the wingtips to keep the wings from scraping the ground when the aircraft was taxiing. This arrangement meant that the B-52 could actually land in a crosswind with its wheels pointed straight ahead and the entire aircraft crabted at an angle to the runway direction. The main gear wheels could be rotated up to 20 degrees in either direction to allow the aircraft to track straight down a runway, even when the wind was coming from the side. It is one of the most elegant engineering solutions in aviation history, and it works so well that it has never needed to be changed in 70 years of service. The cockpit design was another area where Boeing pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The B-52 was designed to be operated by a crew of 6, later reduced to 5 in more modern versions. The aircraft commander and the co-pilot sat side by side in a conventional cockpit arrangement at the top of the aircraft. But below them, in what was essentially a second cockpit built into the lower portion of the nose, sat the navigator and the radar navigator, who was also responsible for aiming and releasing the aircraft's weapons. This 2-level crew arrangement was unique in aviation and reflected the complexity of the missions the B-52 was expected to fly. Navigating to targets deep inside the Soviet Union at night, in all weather conditions, using the technology available in the early 1950s, was an extraordinarily demanding task. The radar navigator's equipment was, at the time, the most sophisticated bombing system ever installed in any aircraft anywhere in the world. The XB-52, the experimental prototype of the aircraft, rolled out of Boeing's factory in Seattle on November 29, 1951. It was an astonishing sight. The aircraft was enormous. Its wingspan stretched nearly 185 feet from tip to tip. Its fuselage was over 156 feet long. Standing next to it, a full-grown adult was dwarfed to the point of appearing almost childlike. And yet, despite its massive size, there was something about the B-52 that looked swift and purposeful. The swept wings gave it an aggressive, forward-leaning posture even when sitting still on the ground. The 8 engines, hanging in their distinctive paired pods beneath the wings, gave it an air of barely contained power. The first flight of the XB-52 took place on April 15, 1952. Test pilot Tex Johnston was at the controls, and he later described the experience as unlike anything he had ever felt in an aircraft before. The B-52, despite its enormous weight, was smooth and responsive. Its 8 engines combined to produce a thrust that seemed almost limitless. Johnston pushed the aircraft through its initial test maneuvers and came back to land with the kind of smile on his face that told everyone on the ground that something special had just happened. The Air Force ordered the aircraft into production immediately. But even as the production lines were being set up, Boeing's engineers were already working on improvements. The early production versions of the B-52, the A and B models, were rapidly followed by the C, D, and E models, each incorporating lessons learned from the aircraft's flight testing and early service experience. By the time the definitive early production version, the B-52D, was rolling off the assembly lines, the aircraft had already undergone hundreds of modifications and improvements from the original hotel room design. The B-52 entered operational service with the Strategic Air Command in June 1955, and from the very first day it arrived at its bases, it transformed the way that American military planners thought about the projection of power. Before the B-52, strategic bombing required careful, methodical planning around the limitations of existing aircraft. Missions had to be planned with multiple refueling stops. Targets deep inside the Soviet Union required forward-deployed aircraft operating from bases in Europe or the Pacific. The B-52 changed all of that, with aerial refueling, which was by the mid-1950s becoming a standard operational procedure for Strategic Air Command. The B-52 could fly from bases in the continental United States, refuel from Boeing KC-135 tanker aircraft over the North Atlantic or the Pacific, strike targets anywhere in the Soviet Union, and return home. The Soviet Union's entire territory, every city, every military base, every industrial facility, every command center was suddenly within reach of American nuclear weapons. The psychological impact of this capability on both sides of the Cold War was enormous. The Soviet military knew that every corner of their vast country was now a potential target. And American military planners knew that they finally had the weapon they needed to deter Soviet aggression in Europe and around the world. But the B-52 was not just a deterrent sitting on the ground looking threatening. From almost the moment it entered service, the B-52 was put to work in ways that the public never saw and never knew about. During the height of the Cold War, Strategic Air Command maintained an alert posture unlike anything in American military history before or since. B-52s were kept loaded with nuclear weapons, fueled and ready to fly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Crews slept in alert facilities adjacent to the runway, their aircraft ready to taxi and take off within 15 minutes of receiving an alert order. At any given moment during the 1960s, a significant number of B-52s were actually airborne, flying predetermined routes over the Arctic and the North Atlantic, ready to turn toward their Soviet targets at a moment's notice if the order to launch was ever given. This was Operation Chrome Dome, and it was one of the most extraordinary and least known military operations in American history. Day after day, night after night, month after month, year after year, B-52s flew their alert routes. Crews spent days at a time in the air, sleeping in shifts while their aircraft droned through the darkness over the frozen north. The pressure on these crews was immense. They were, quite literally, the tip of the spear of American nuclear deterrence. The fate of the world rested, in some very real sense, on their shoulders. But Chrome Dome, as extraordinary as it was, also brought with it some of the most terrifying incidents in American nuclear history. Incidents that were kept secret from the public for decades. In January 1961, a B-52 carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs broke up in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Both bombs fell free of the disintegrating aircraft. One bomb parachuted safely to the ground. The other went through a series of arming steps as it fell, and when investigators recovered it from a muddy field, they found that 5 of its 6 safety mechanisms had failed. A single switch, a simple electrical connection, was all that stood between a nuclear detonation on American soil and the continuation of civilization in the southeastern United States. The Department of Defense classified this incident for decades. When the documents were finally declassified and a researcher named Eric Schlosser wrote about it in his book Command and Control in 2013, Americans were stunned. How close had they come to a nuclear catastrophe on their own soil? The answer was terrifyingly close. In January 1966, a B-52 collided with a KC-135 tanker during a refueling operation over Palomares, Spain. The B-52 broke apart and 4 hydrogen bombs fell on Spanish territory. 3 were recovered on land with varying degrees of conventional explosive damage. 1 fell into the Mediterranean Sea and was not recovered for 80 days, requiring an extensive search operation. In January 1968, a B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland while carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. A fire aboard the aircraft forced the crew to bail out before the aircraft could land, and the B-52 struck the sea ice of North Star Bay and disintegrated. The conventional explosives in the bombs detonated on impact, scattering radioactive material across a large area of sea ice. These accidents, and others less dramatic, were the hidden cost of maintaining the continuous airborne alert that was the backbone of American nuclear deterrence during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. And through all of them, the B-52 itself continued to fly, continued to serve, continued to evolve. The aircraft that would make the B-52 truly famous, not in the shadowy world of nuclear deterrence, but in the very public world of conventional warfare, was born in the rice paddies and jungle mountains of Southeast Asia. By the mid-1960s, the United States was deeply committed to the conflict in Vietnam, and military planners began to realize that the B-52, with its enormous bomb load and its ability to strike from high altitude with extreme accuracy, could be a devastating weapon not against Soviet nuclear facilities, but against the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. The missions that followed would transform the B-52 from a Cold War nuclear deterrent into a conventional warfare icon, and they would also reveal something about the aircraft that no one had quite anticipated. The first B-52 combat missions in Southeast Asia took place in June 1965 under the codename Operation Arclight. A formation of 27 B-52DS flew from Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam to strike a suspected Viet Cong stronghold in Binh Duong Province in South Vietnam. The mission did not begin auspiciously. Two of the B-52s collided during the air refueling phase of the mission, both crashing into the Pacific Ocean. But the remaining aircraft completed their mission, and the results on the ground were extraordinary. Each B-52D could carry up to 108 conventional bombs in its internal bomb bay and on external underwing pylons. A formation of B-52s saturating a target area created a carpet of explosions that was virtually impossible to survive. The psychological effect on enemy troops who survived the strikes was as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers who had been in a B-52 strike zone described the experience as like the end of the world. The bombs fell without warning. There was no sound of approaching aircraft, no air raid sirens, no chance to take cover, because by the time you could hear the aircraft, the bombs were already falling. Arclight missions became a regular feature of the Vietnam War. B-52s struck targets throughout South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They supported American and South Vietnamese ground forces in some of the most intense battles of the war. During the Siege of Khe Sanh in early 1968, when a Marine Corps base was surrounded by North Vietnamese Army forces for 77 days, B-52 strikes were instrumental in breaking up enemy attacks and keeping the base supplied. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, later said that without the B-52 strikes around Khe Sanh, the base could not have been held. But the most dramatic and most controversial use of the B-52 in Vietnam came in December 1972 with Operation Linebacker II. By this point, the Paris peace talks aimed at ending the Vietnam War had stalled. The Nixon administration decided to use maximum air power to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. For 11 days, from December 18th to December 29th, 1972, B-52 struck targets in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas of North Vietnam in the most concentrated bombing campaign since World War II. Over those 11 days, more than 700 B-52 sorties were flown. The aircraft dropped nearly 15,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnamese targets. The North Vietnamese air defenses fought back furiously. They fired hundreds of surface-to-air missiles. They scrambled their MiG fighter aircraft. They brought every weapon at their disposal to bear against the incoming waves of B-52s. And they succeeded in shooting down 15 B-52s during the campaign. 33 American aircrewmen were killed. Another 33 were captured and became prisoners of war. The crews who flew those missions knew they were flying into the most intense air defenses in history. They knew that some of them were not coming back. But they flew anyway, mission after mission, night after night, into the teeth of the North Vietnamese defenses. By December 29th, North Vietnam's air defenses were largely exhausted. Their supply of surface-to-air missiles was running critically low. Their radar networks had been heavily damaged. On January 8, 1973, the Paris peace talks resumed. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, ending American involvement in the Vietnam War. Whether Linebacker 2 was the decisive factor in bringing North Vietnam back to the table remains debated by historians to this day. But what is beyond debate is that the B-52 performed magnificently in the most demanding combat environment it had ever faced. The Vietnam experience fundamentally changed the B-52 and how it was used. Before Vietnam, the B-52 was primarily conceived as a high-altitude nuclear bomber. After Vietnam, military planners recognized that the aircraft's conventional bombing capability was equally, if not more valuable. The B-52D models used in Vietnam were modified extensively to carry the enormous conventional bomb loads required for arc-light missions. But the aircraft that emerged from Vietnam was in many ways a different beast from the one that had entered the conflict. And the Air Force was already working on what would become the most capable version of the B-52 ever built. The B-52G and B-52H models, which had entered service in the late 1950s and early 1960s respectively, were significantly different from the earlier versions of the aircraft. They were lighter. They were faster. They had more fuel-efficient engines. The B-52H in particular, with its Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan engines replacing the earlier water-injected turbojets, was a dramatically more efficient aircraft than the first B-52s that had entered service 20 years earlier. The H model is the only version of the B-52 still flying today. All 76 of the B-52HS that remain in the Air Force inventory are H models, and they have been so extensively modified from their original configuration that only a small fraction of the original aircraft remains in any practical sense. The engines are different. The avionics are different. The weapons systems are different. The cockpit instrumentation is different. In many ways, the B-52H of today has more in common with a modern aircraft than it does with the original 1948 design. And that is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire B-52 story. The end of the Cold War in 1991 might have seemed like the end of the B-52 story. The Soviet Union dissolved. The nuclear threat that had justified the B-52's existence for 4 decades suddenly seemed much less acute. Newer aircraft were in service. The B-1B Lancer, a supersonic swept-wing bomber, had entered service in 1986. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was on its way. Surely the ancient B-52, a design that was by 1991 already over 40 years old, would now be retired, its long service honored with a place in a museum somewhere. But the Air Force had other ideas. Because just as the Cold War was ending, the B-52 was about to demonstrate something new about itself. It was about to prove that it was not just a relic of the nuclear age, not just a Cold War deterrent, but a genuinely versatile, adaptable, devastatingly effective combat aircraft that could contribute to American military power in ways that no one had fully appreciated before. The proof came in the Persian Gulf. In January 1991, the United States led a coalition of nations to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. Operation Desert Storm was, among other things, a showcase for American air power. On the very first night of the air campaign, B-52GS launched from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, flew across the Atlantic Ocean, refueled multiple times from KC-135 tankers, launched conventional air-launched cruise missiles at targets in Iraq, and then flew all the way home. The round-trip distance was approximately 14,000 miles. It was, at the time, the longest combat mission ever flown. The B-52 GS that flew that mission never even crossed into Iraqi airspace. They launched their cruise missiles from positions over the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and then turned for home. But as the air campaign progressed, B-52s were flying conventional bombing missions over Iraqi forces in Kuwait, dropping the same kind of carpet bombing strikes that had proven so devastatingly effective in Vietnam. Iraqi soldiers who surrendered during the ground campaign repeatedly cited the B-52 strikes as the most terrifying experience of their lives, and as a primary reason, they chose to surrender rather than continue fighting. The performance of the B-52 in Desert Storm silenced the critics who had been arguing for the aircraft's retirement. Here was a 40-year-old design performing missions that no other aircraft in the American inventory could perform with the same combination of range, payload, and flexibility. But the Air Force and Boeing were not content to let the aircraft rest on its Gulf War laurels. The years following Desert Storm saw an extraordinary program of modernization and upgrade work that transformed the B-52H into something that the aircraft's original designers would have found almost unimaginable. The avionics were completely replaced. The old analog instruments in the cockpit gave way to modern digital displays. The aircraft received the ability to carry and employ precision-guided munitions, completely changing its role from a carpet bombing weapon into a precision strike platform. The Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDM, which uses GPS guidance to steer conventional bombs to within a few meters of their intended targets, gave the B-52H a surgical precision that complemented its massive bomb load in ways that made it uniquely valuable on the modern battlefield. The integration of the AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile, carrying either conventional or nuclear warheads with a range of more than 1,500 miles, gave the B-52H the ability to strike targets from outside the range of most air defense systems. The integration of the Joint Standoff Weapon, the JSSM, and eventually the JSSM Extended Range, with a range of more than 550 miles, further extended the aircraft's ability to strike from safe distances. By the early 2000s, the B-52H had been transformed from a Cold War nuclear bomber into perhaps the most flexible and capable conventional strike platform in the world. It could deliver nuclear cruise missiles. It could deliver conventional cruise missiles. It could deliver precision-guided bombs. It could deliver conventional unguided bombs in the traditional carpet bombing role. It could carry anti-ship missiles. It could lay naval mines. It could perform maritime patrol missions. No other aircraft in any air force in the world could do all of these things from a single airframe. The proof of the modernized B-52's versatility came on October 7, 2001, when the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks. B-52HS were among the first aircraft to strike targets in Afghanistan, flying once again from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and from other forward-deployed bases. But this time, they were not carpet-bombing large formations of enemy troops. They were using precision-guided munitions to strike individual buildings, individual vehicles, individual cave entrances in the mountains of Tora Bora. The same aircraft that had once rained hundreds of unguided bombs across miles of Vietnamese jungle was now placing individual GPS-guided weapons within meters of specific targets. And something else happened in Afghanistan that illustrated the B-52's unique value in a way that no military planner had fully anticipated. American ground forces, small teams of special operations soldiers working with Afghan Northern Alliance fighters, found themselves in close contact firefights with Taliban forces. They needed close air support, and they needed it fast. The B-52, with its ability to carry large numbers of precision-guided weapons and to loiter over a battlefield for extended periods, proved to be extraordinarily effective in this role. Forward air controllers on the ground would call on targets. The B-52 crews would lock the coordinates into their weapons systems, and minutes later Taliban fighters who had been pouring fire on American troops would simply cease to exist. The B-52 that had been designed to fly at high altitude over the Soviet Union was now providing close air support to infantry soldiers in the mountains of Afghanistan. The flexibility was staggering. Through the early 2000s and into the 2010s, as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq ground on, the B-52 flew mission after mission, year after year. Crew after crew rotated through the aircraft, young pilots and navigators flying the same type of aircraft that their fathers, and in some cases their grandfathers, had flown. There are airmen flying the B-52 today whose grandfathers flew the same aircraft during the Vietnam War. Think about that for a moment. 3 generations of American military aviators flying the same aircraft. It has never happened before in American history. It has never happened before in the history of any Air Force anywhere in the world. But perhaps the most remarkable chapter in the B-52 story is the one that is being written right now. Because in 2023, the United States Air Force made a decision that shocked even the most ardent B-52 supporters. A decision that makes the aircraft's future more certain than at any point in the past 30 years. The Air Force announced that it was proceeding with a program called the Commercial Engine Replacement Program, or CRP. The B-52H's existing Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan engines, which have been in service for over 60 years and which are becoming increasingly expensive to maintain and operate, are going to be replaced with brand new Rolls-Royce F-130 turbofan engines. New engines. Brand new, 21st century, fuel-efficient, powerful, maintainable engines being fitted to an aircraft designed in 1948. The new engines will give the B-52H improved fuel efficiency, giving the aircraft even greater range than it currently has. They will reduce the aircraft's maintenance burdens significantly, because spare parts for the aging TF-33 engines are increasingly difficult to source. They will make the aircraft quieter, believe it or not, reducing its acoustic signature in ways that may actually improve its survivability in some threat environments. The first B-52 with new engines is expected to be delivered around 2027. And with those new engines, the Air Force is confident that the B-52 will remain a viable combat aircraft all the way through 2050 and quite possibly beyond. Add in new radar systems, new electronic warfare suites, new communication systems, new weapons integration, and what you have is an aircraft that will soon be, in almost every meaningful operational sense, a modern aircraft in a vintage airframe. Why does the B-52 keep surviving when every other aircraft designed in its era has long since been retired? The B-17 is in museums. The B-29 is in museums. The B-47, a beautiful and capable jet bomber that was contemporary with the B-52, has been gone for decades. The B-58 Hustler, a supersonic bomber that was supposed to replace the B-52, flew for only a decade before being retired. The B-1B Lancer, the supersonic bomber that was supposed to render the B-52 obsolete, is now being reduced in numbers as the Air Force struggles to keep it maintained and operational. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the most expensive aircraft per unit in history at more than $2 billion per aircraft, is also being reduced in numbers. And yet the B-52 flies on. Part of the answer is purely practical. The B-52 size gives it a payload capacity that no other aircraft can match. It can carry more weapons than anything else in the American inventory. And in the modern era of precision-guided munitions, that payload capacity translates directly into mission flexibility and effectiveness. Where a smaller aircraft might carry 2 or 4 weapons on a single mission, A B-52 can carry dozens. It can address multiple targets on a single sortie. It can loiter over a battlefield for extended periods, providing on-call support to ground forces in a way that faster but shorter-ranged aircraft simply cannot. But the deeper answer to why the B-52 keeps surviving is about something more fundamental than payload capacity or fuel efficiency. It is about the aircraft's basic design philosophy. When Ed Wells and his team designed the B-52 in that Dayton hotel room in 1948, they built something with almost limitless internal volume. The aircraft's enormous fuselage and wing structure can accommodate upgrades, new systems, and new equipment in ways that smaller, more tightly optimized aircraft simply cannot. Every time a new technology has come along, every time a new weapon has been developed, every time a new mission requirement has emerged, the B-52's designers and maintainers have been able to integrate that new capability into the existing airframe without tearing the entire aircraft apart. The B-52 is not just an aircraft. It is a platform in the truest sense of that word. A flexible, adaptable, almost infinitely upgradable foundation on which successive generations of military technology have been built. And then there is the cost argument, which in a modern era of defense budget constraints is perhaps the most powerful argument of all. Building a new bomber is extraordinarily expensive. The B-21 Raider, the Air Force's new stealth bomber, which is currently in development and early production, costs somewhere in the range of $700 million to $1 billion per aircraft. The Air Force plans to buy at least 100 of them. Even at the low end of the cost estimate, that is $70 billion just for the aircraft themselves, before you add in the cost of basing, training, maintenance, spare parts, and operational expenses over decades of service life. Keeping the B-52 flying, by contrast, is relatively inexpensive. The engine replacement program, massive though it sounds, costs a fraction of what it would cost to replace the aircraft with something new. The avionics upgrades and weapons integration work are similarly cost-effective given the aircraft's enormous remaining service life. In a world of constrained defense budgets and competing military priorities, the B-52 represents something genuinely rare in government procurement. It represents value. It does more for less money than any conceivable alternative. The Air Force has done this calculation repeatedly over the past 3 decades. Every time someone has proposed retiring the B-52, and every time the numbers have come back the same way. Keep the B-52 flying. It is the cheapest, most capable, most flexible option available. But numbers and cost calculations do not fully capture what the B-52 means to the people who fly it and maintain it. To understand that, you need to talk to the crews. You need to talk to the young pilots and weapons systems officers who fly the aircraft today, many of them in their mid-20s, who grew up in a world of smartphones and internet and streaming video, and who now find themselves responsible for operating and maintaining systems that were designed before their parents were born. You need to talk to the maintainers, the enlisted men and women who work on the aircraft in all weather conditions, at all hours of the day and night, keeping its systems running and its airframes airworthy. What you find when you talk to these people is something unexpected. You find pride. Deep, genuine, unironic pride in the aircraft they serve. The B-52 has a personality that newer aircraft simply do not have. It has a history, a weight of accumulated experience and achievement that makes flying it feel like something more than just operating a piece of equipment. When a young pilot climbs into the cockpit of a B-52 for the first time, they are sitting in the same seat where aviators sat during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during Vietnam, during Desert Storm, during the opening hours of the Afghanistan campaign. The aircraft carries its history with it in a way that few human creations do. And the crews who fly it feel that connection to something larger than themselves, larger than any individual mission, larger than any particular conflict. They are part of a tradition that spans 7 decades and shows no sign of ending. The B-52 community within the Air Force has its own culture, its own traditions, its own unofficial ceremonies and rituals that have been passed down from crew to crew for generations. There is a camaraderie in the B-52 world that comes from shared challenge, from the experience of operating a complex, demanding aircraft on difficult missions in challenging conditions. It is a camaraderie that connects the crews flying today to the crews who flew the same aircraft during the Cold War, during Vietnam, during the Gulf War. It is a living connection to military history that is completely unique. There is also the question of what the B-52 means strategically in the world of 2024 and beyond. The aircraft was born in the early Cold War as a deterrent against Soviet aggression. It served through the conventional wars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And now, as the world enters what many analysts are calling a new era of great power competition, with China's military power growing rapidly and Russia reasserting its ambitions in Europe, the B-52 strategic role is once again coming to the fore. The aircraft still carries nuclear weapons. It is still a key component of America's nuclear triad, the three-legged deterrent structure of land-based ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and bomber aircraft. But it is the bomber leg of that triad that is in some ways the most flexible and the most politically useful, because unlike ballistic missiles in silos or submarines prowling the ocean depths, bombers can be moved. They can be deployed to forward bases as a signal of resolve. They can be seen by adversaries, which is sometimes exactly the point. When the United States wants to send a message to North Korea, or China, or Russia, or Iran, deploying B-52s to bases in the Western Pacific or to bases in Europe is one of the most visible and unmistakable ways to do it. The aircraft's sheer size and its historical reputation for destruction make it a uniquely powerful political symbol as well as a military weapon. In recent years, B-52s have made numerous deployments to the Indo-Pacific region as part of the United States' effort to reassure allies and deter Chinese military adventurism in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. They have flown missions in support of NATO allies in Europe in the shadow of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They have participated in joint exercises with allies from South Korea to Australia to the United Kingdom. The B-52 is not just an American weapon. It is a symbol of American commitment to its allies and partners around the world. And that symbolic value, combined with its genuine military capability, makes it one of the most strategically valuable assets in the American military inventory. Looking ahead to the 2030s and 2040s, the B-52 will operate in an environment that is very different from anything its designers could have imagined. The air defense systems being developed by China and Russia are extraordinarily capable. They can track and engage aircraft at very long ranges. They use advanced radar systems that can detect even stealthy aircraft in some conditions. Against these threats, the B-52 will not be a penetrating bomber, flying into the heart of enemy territory to drop bombs on defended targets. It will instead operate as what military planners call a standoff platform, a missile truck, loaded with dozens of long-range cruise missiles and other standoff weapons. The B-52 will launch its weapons from hundreds or even thousands of miles away from the target, outside the range of enemy air defenses. The aircraft itself never needs to enter the threat envelope. Its job is simply to carry as many weapons as possible to the launch point and then release them. And in this role, the B-52's enormous payload capacity is not just an advantage. It is irreplaceable. No other aircraft in the American inventory can carry as many standoff weapons on a single sortie as the B-52. Not the B-1B, not the B-2, not the F-15E. Not any aircraft currently flying or currently in development, except for the B-21 Raider, which will be complementing rather than replacing the B-52 in the Air Force inventory. The B-52 and the B-21 will fly together, each doing what it does best. The B-21 will penetrate defended airspace in the stealth role. The B-52 will saturate the same airspace with cruise missiles and standoff weapons from long range. Together, they represent a 1-2 combination that no adversary air defense system will be able to fully counter. The story of the B-52 is ultimately a story about America, about what America does best when it puts its mind to something. It is a story about engineering genius, about the ability to take a sketch on a piece of hotel room paper and turn it into one of the most formidable weapons ever built. It is a story about adaptability, about the ability to take a weapon designed for one purpose and continuously reshape it for new purposes as the world changes around it. It is a story about institutional commitment, about the ability to look at something old and proven and choose to invest in it rather than throwing it away for the sake of something newer and shinier. It is a story about the men and women who have dedicated years of their lives to flying and maintaining and improving this remarkable aircraft. The names of most of them will never be known outside the tight circles of the military community. They flew their missions, they maintained their aircraft, they did their jobs with skill and courage and dedication, and they passed the torch to the next generation. And the next generation passed it to the generation after that. And that generation will pass it to the generation after them. The B-52 will still be flying in the 2040s, possibly in the early 2050s. The airmen flying it in those years are children today, playing with toys and going to school and having no idea yet that one day they will strap themselves into the cockpit of an aircraft that their great-grandparents might have watched on the evening news. They will fly missions in a world we cannot yet fully imagine, with weapons that do not yet fully exist, against threats that are still taking shape. And they will do it in an aircraft that Ed Wells sketched on a piece of paper in a hotel room in Dayton, Ohio, over a single extraordinary weekend in October 1948. No other aircraft in history has demonstrated anything like this longevity. No other weapon system of any kind has remained continuously relevant, continuously improved, and continuously deployed for anything approaching a century of service. The B-52 is not just an aircraft. It is an argument that great design, honest engineering, and the willingness to continuously invest in improvement can produce something that transcends the moment of its creation and becomes, in a very real sense, timeless. The Egyptians built the pyramids and called them eternal. The Greeks built the Parthenon and meant it to last forever. The Americans built the B-52, and the evidence suggests they may have succeeded where others only dreamed. When the last B-52 finally lands for the last time, whenever that day comes, it will be the end of an era unlike anything that has occurred before in the history of military technology. It will be the retirement of an aircraft that flew during the Eisenhower administration and the Trump administration, during Sputnik and the iPhone, during the Berlin Wall and social media, during the first commercial jet flights and the first commercial space flights. It will be, in every meaningful sense, the retirement of a piece of living history. Until that day comes, the B-52 will keep flying. Its 8 engines will keep roaring. Its wings will keep flexing. Its crews will keep training, keep maintaining, keep flying mission after mission into whatever uncertain future awaits us all. And somewhere up there in the sky, invisible from the ground, moving through the darkness at altitude, there's probably a B-52 flying right now. Right this moment. The same aircraft, the same design, the same stubborn, magnificent, irreplaceable machine that Ed Wells built in a hotel room 76 years ago. Still flying, still ready, still the most remarkable bomber that has ever taken to the skies. Now here is a question I want you to think about and answer in the comments below. Given everything you have just heard, given the full extraordinary story of the B-52 Stratofortress from its birth in a hotel room in 1948 to its projected service through 2050, Do you believe that any aircraft currently in development, or even currently imaginable, will ever match the B-52's record of longevity, adaptability, and continuous relevance? What would it take to build another aircraft that could serve for a century? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it gave you a new appreciation for the extraordinary ingenuity and determination that went into building and sustaining this remarkable aircraft, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who loves military history as much as you do. Because these are the stories that deserve to be told, and you are the reason we tell them.